A man everyone thought was worthless becomes the town's greatest hero in one night. But here's the crazy part. He had a secret that would have changed everything if they just bothered to look beyond his torn clothes and weathered face. What you're about to hear isn't just another feel-good story. It's about Thomas Mitchell, a man who lost everything, and how one terrible night in Millbrook became the moment that revealed who he really was. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at someone struggling the same way again. This story will shake you to your core. Because sometimes, the person we judge the harshest is exactly the person we need the most. Thomas Mitchell wasn't always the man people crossed the street to avoid. 3 years ago, he was Dr. Thomas Mitchell, one of the most respected physicians in the state. You know those doctors who actually care? The ones who remember your kids' names and stay late to make sure you're okay? That was Thomas. He had a beautiful home on Maple Street, drove a decent car, and yeah, he had respect. But life has this brutal way of reminding us how quickly everything can change. It started with his wife, Sarah. Cancer, the kind that fights dirty and doesn't give you time to prepare. Thomas spent every penny he had on treatments, specialists, experimental drugs. He mortgaged the house twice, sold his car, even borrowed money from colleagues who whispered behind his back about his obsession with saving her. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning in October, and something inside Thomas died with her. The medical board review came 6 months later. See, when you're drowning in grief and debt, you make mistakes. Thomas had been prescribing pain medication to help people, good people who couldn't afford proper treatment. In his mind, he was still healing. In the board's eyes, he was breaking the law. They stripped his license. Just like that. No more Dr. Mitchell. Just Thomas. A man with nothing left. That's how he ended up in Millbrook, a small town where nobody knew his story and frankly, nobody cared to learn it. He'd been living there for 8 months when our story really begins, sleeping in the old bus station, surviving on whatever odd jobs people would throw his way. And those jobs? They weren't exactly rolling in. You see, Millbrook had a problem with outsiders. Especially outsiders who looked like they'd been through hell. Thomas had let his hair grow long, his beard go wild. His clothes were whatever he could find at the thrift store, usually torn or stained. His shoes had holes that let in the rain. To the people of Millbrook, Thomas Mitchell was just another drifter. Another failure. Another person to avoid eye contact with. But here's what they didn't know. Thomas still carried his medical knowledge like a weight in his chest. Every time he saw someone hurt, every time he watched a kid with a fever or an old man struggling to breathe, those instincts kicked in. He wanted to help. He needed to help. But who listens to a beggar? Let me tell you about the day everything started to change. It was a Wednesday morning, and Thomas was sitting outside Miller's grocery, hoping someone would need help carrying bags for a few dollars. That's when 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez came running down the sidewalk, tears streaming down her face. She tripped. Right there on the concrete. Thomas was the closest person to her, but as he moved to help, Emma's mom, Maria, came rushing out of the store. She saw Thomas reaching for her daughter and, well, you can guess what happened next. "Get away from her!" Maria shouted, scooping Emma up. "Don't you touch my child!" Thomas stepped back, hands raised. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to help. She's hurt." "We don't need help from people like you," Maria snapped. "People like you." Those words hit Thomas harder than any physical blow could have. Emma was crying harder now, holding her arm at an odd angle. Thomas could see it from where he stood, a clear fracture. The little girl needed immediate medical attention, but Maria was already walking away, more concerned with getting her daughter away from the dangerous homeless man than getting her proper care. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Last month, Thomas had tried to help old Mr. Peterson when he'd collapsed outside the bank. The paramedics arrived just as Thomas was checking his pulse, and they literally pushed him away, assuming he was trying to rob the unconscious man. 2 weeks before that, he'd noticed suspicious symptoms in Janet Walsh at the diner, signs that screamed heart problems to his trained eye. When he gently suggested she might want to see a doctor, she laughed in his face and told the whole restaurant about the crazy homeless guy giving medical advice. You know what the worst part was? Thomas was usually right. Emma did have a fracture. He saw her in a cast 2 days later. Mr. Peterson had indeed been having a heart episode. And Janet? She ended up in the hospital the following week with chest pains. But nobody connected the dots. Nobody wondered if maybe, just maybe, the quiet man they all ignored might actually know something. The town had made up their minds about Thomas Mitchell. He was worthless. A failure. A cautionary tale they could point to and say, "See? That's what happens when you don't get your life together." Mayor Davidson was particularly vocal about this. Every town council meeting he'd bring up the vagrant problem and how it was bad for business. "Tourists don't want to see people like that when they visit our charming town," he'd say, conveniently ignoring the fact that Thomas had never caused trouble for anyone. The police chief, Officer Reynolds, would nod along. "We've got to maintain standards," he'd agree, though to his credit, he never actually harassed Thomas. Just kept an eye on him. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Sometimes it's the perfect foundation to build something stronger. Thomas had started noticing things other people missed. When you're invisible, you see a lot. You overhear conversations. You notice patterns. You watch. And what Thomas had been watching lately was troubling. There'd been strange sounds coming from the old mine shaft outside town. Rumbling noises that didn't match the usual settling of abandoned structures. Then there were the small tremors, barely noticeable unless you were sleeping on the ground like Thomas was. Most concerning were the cracks. Tiny fissures appearing in the foundation of the town hall. Hairline fractures in the sidewalks that seemed to grow a little wider each day. Thomas had tried to mention it to someone, anyone who would listen. But who takes geological concerns seriously when they come from a homeless man? The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man trained to recognize symptoms and diagnose problems, and he was seeing symptoms everywhere. Not in people this time, but in the very ground beneath Millbrook. Something was wrong. Something big. And as Thomas sat there that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky red behind the mountains, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He just didn't know how right he was. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone? Have you ever judged a book by its cover and missed something incredible? Drop a comment below, because what happens next in Thomas's story will make you question everything you think you know about the people around you. ***. 3 days after the incident with little Emma, Thomas Mitchell was doing what he always did, watching. It was 6:47 a.m., and he was sitting on his usual bench outside the post office, sipping coffee that Mrs. Chin from the corner shop had given him. She was one of the few people who showed him basic kindness. The morning routine in Millbrook was as predictable as clockwork. Business owners unlocking their shops, kids walking to school, commuters heading to work in the city. But Thomas noticed something the others didn't. The birds weren't singing. Now, I know what you're thinking, so what? Birds have off days too, right? But Thomas had been living outside for 8 months. He knew the rhythms of this place better than anyone. Every morning, the maple trees around the town square would come alive with sparrows and cardinals. Today, silence. That's when he felt it. A tremor so slight that most people would have dismissed it as a heavy truck passing by. But Thomas wasn't standing on pavement. He was sitting on a bench that was bolted directly into the concrete foundation of the post office. He knew the difference between surface vibrations and something deeper. Something much deeper. Thomas stood up quickly, his coffee spilling to the ground. He knelt down and pressed his ear to the sidewalk, ignoring the stares from early commuters who were probably thinking the homeless guy had finally lost it completely. There was a rhythmic pulsing from underground. Not mechanical, this was something organic. Something alive. But that was impossible, wasn't it? "Hey, what are you doing?" Thomas looked up to see Officer Reynolds walking toward him, hand resting casually on his belt. Not aggressive, but definitely suspicious. "Officer Reynolds," Thomas said, standing slowly. "I need to report something. There's seismic activity." "Seismic activity?" Reynolds interrupted with a chuckle. "Doc, we're not in California. This is Pennsylvania. We don't have earthquakes here." Document Reynolds had called him Document. For a moment, Thomas wondered if somehow the officer had figured out who he really was. But no, it was just sarcasm. The kind of mocking nickname you give to someone you think is crazy. "I know how it sounds," Thomas pressed on, but I've been monitoring unusual vibrations for weeks. The patterns are consistent with underground instability. We might be dealing with a sinkhole formation or worse. Look, buddy. Reynolds's tone shifted from amused to irritated. I appreciate your concern. But maybe stick to what you know, okay? Which is... He gestured vaguely at Thomas's appearance. What he knew. If only Reynolds had any idea what Thomas actually knew. But Thomas didn't push it. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Instead, he nodded and walked away, leaving Officer Reynolds shaking his head and probably adding another story to tell the guys at the station about the weird homeless dude. The thing is, Thomas wasn't giving up. He couldn't. Not when every instinct he had, scientific and otherwise, was screaming that something catastrophic was building beneath their feet. So he started documenting everything. Using a notebook he'd found in the library's trash bin, Thomas began mapping the tremors. He marked locations, times, intensities. He sketched the crack patterns he'd observed around town. He even attempted to measure the intervals between vibrations using his watch. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The epicenter seemed to be directly beneath the elementary school. Washington Elementary, where 340 kids spent their days learning math and reading stories, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was changing. Thomas knew he had to try again. He had to make someone listen. His first stop was Principal Anderson. Thomas cleaned himself up as best he could in the library bathroom, combed his hair with his fingers, and practiced what he would say. He approached the school during lunch hour, hoping to catch Anderson outside. He never made it past the front gate. "Excuse me, sir." A security guard, when did elementary schools start having security guards? Stepped in front of Thomas. "Can I help you? I need to speak with Principal Anderson about a safety concern." The guard looked Thomas up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the weathered face, the desperate look in his eyes. What kind of safety concern? Geological instability. There's seismic activity beneath the school that could indicate. "I'm going to need you to leave the premises," the guard interrupted. "But the children." "Sir, I'm not going to ask again." Thomas walked away, but he didn't give up. He tried the fire department next, thinking they'd be trained to take safety concerns seriously. Fire Chief Martinez listened politely for about 30 seconds before explaining that they only dealt with fires, medical emergencies, and rescue operations. "Geological surveys aren't really our thing," Martinez said with a shrug. The mayor's office wouldn't even let him past the reception desk. The newspaper? Editor Jackson actually laughed when Thomas tried to explain his findings. "Look, pal, I appreciate a good story, but homeless man predicts earthquake isn't exactly front-page material. Maybe try the National Enquirer." That night, Thomas sat in his usual spot at the bus station, staring at his notebook full of observations that nobody wanted to hear. The data was solid. He was sure of it. The patterns were clear, the progression was accelerating, and the implications were terrifying. But he was just a homeless man. His word meant nothing. You know what the cruelest irony was? If Dr. Thomas Mitchell had walked into any of those offices 3 years ago, they would have hung on his every word. They would have evacuated the school, called in geological experts, maybe even declared a state of emergency. But Thomas the beggar? Thomas the failure? His warnings were just the ramblings of a man who'd clearly lost his mind along with everything else. That's when he heard it again. Stronger this time. A deep, resonant pulse from underground that made the bus station's windows vibrate slightly. Thomas grabbed his notebook and added another entry. Day 23. 11:43 p.m. Major tremor. Duration approximately 8 seconds. Intensity increasing. Then he wrote something else. Something that would prove prophetic. Estimate 48 to 72 hours before critical failure. As Thomas tried to sleep that night on the hard bench, using his jacket as a pillow, he couldn't stop thinking about those 340 kids at Washington Elementary. About the families living in the houses closest to what he now believed was an underground cavern system that was slowly collapsing. He thought about Emma Rodriguez, the little girl with the broken arm whose mother had called him dangerous. About Mrs. Chin, who showed him kindness. About Officer Reynolds and Mayor Davidson and all the people who saw him as worthless. They had no idea what was coming. But Thomas did. And he had less than 3 days to figure out how to save them all. 5:30 a.m., Friday morning. Thomas Mitchell woke up to a sound that made his heart stop. Not the alarm from his broken watch, but something much worse. Cracking. Deep, resonant cracking, like the earth itself was splitting apart. He bolted upright from the bus station bench, immediately pressing his ear to the ground. The vibrations were different now, not the rhythmic pulsing he'd been tracking, but something chaotic. Violent. This was it. The critical failure he'd predicted. And according to his calculations, they had maybe 6 hours before complete collapse. Thomas grabbed his notebook and ran toward the center of town, his feet pounding against pavement that now showed visible cracks. New ones. Fresh ones that definitely weren't there yesterday. He had to try one more time. He had to make someone listen. The fire station was his first stop. It was closest, and firefighters were trained for emergency response. Thomas burst through the front door at 5:47 a.m., startling 2 firefighters who were drinking coffee and preparing for their shift. "You need to evacuate the elementary school," Thomas said, trying to catch his breath. "And the residential district on Elm Street. Underground collapse imminent." Firefighter Johnson, Thomas had learned his name from overheard conversations, looked at his partner with raised eyebrows. "It's you again. Listen, buddy, we told you. The ground is failing." Thomas interrupted, holding up his notebook. "I've been tracking seismic activity for 3 weeks. The pattern indicates a massive cavern system beneath the school. The support structure is compromised." "Show me your credentials," Johnson said calmly. "Credentials? Of course. I don't have official credentials, but…" "Then I can't help you." Thomas ran to the police station next. Officer Reynolds was just arriving for his shift, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. "Officer Reynolds. Please, you have to listen to me." Reynolds sighed heavily. "Thomas, we've been through this. You can't just… Look at the ground." Thomas pointed to a crack in the sidewalk that had widened overnight. "Look at the foundation of the station house. Those cracks weren't there yesterday." Reynolds glanced down, and for a moment, Thomas saw something flicker in his eyes. Concern? But it was gone quickly. "Buildings settle. Concrete cracks. It's normal wear and tear." "This isn't wear and tear. This is structural failure on a massive scale." Reynolds studied Thomas for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than usual. "Look, I can see you really believe this. But we can't evacuate half the town based on observations from someone without geological training." Someone without geological training. If only he knew. That's when Thomas made a decision that would have seemed crazy to anyone watching, but when you're out of options, crazy becomes your only choice. He was going to evacuate that school himself. Thomas ran the 6 blocks to Washington Elementary, arriving just as the first buses were pulling up. Kids were streaming off, backpacks bouncing, chattering excitedly about weekend plans they might never get to make. Thomas positioned himself at the main entrance, ignoring the suspicious looks from teachers and parents dropping off their children. "Excuse me," he called out to anyone who would listen. "There's a dangerous situation. The ground beneath the school is unstable. You need to keep your children away from the building." A few parents stopped, confused. "Who are you?" asked Jennifer Walsh. Thomas recognized her from the diner. "I'm someone who's been monitoring seismic activity in this area. There's going to be a collapse." Jennifer looked him up and down, taking in his appearance. Her expression shifted from confusion to disdain. "You're that homeless guy. Are you seriously trying to scare our children?" More parents were gathering now, forming a small crowd around Thomas. Their body language was clear. They saw him as a threat, not a warning. "Please," Thomas said, his voice rising. "I know how I look. I know you have no reason to trust me. But there are 340 children in that building, and the ground beneath them is about to give way." "Someone call the police," Jennifer said. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone." Thomas's voice cracked with desperation. "I'm trying to save them." That's when Principal Anderson emerged from the building, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" "This man is trying to scare the children," Jennifer explained. "He's saying the school is going to collapse." Principal Anderson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor, looked at Thomas with a mixture of concern and confusion. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave school property." Thomas looked at the building behind her. 3 stories of brick and mortar, filled with kids who had no idea their lives were in danger. He could see them through the windows, some in classrooms, some still arriving at their lockers. "Ma'am, I understand your position. But I'm begging you, please, just have a structural engineer look at the building. Look at the foundation. You'll see the cracks, the shifting. Something is very wrong." Anderson's expression softened slightly. "Are you a structural engineer?" "No, ma'am." "Geologist?" "No." "Then what qualifies you to make this assessment?" "The truth." It was time for the truth. "I'm a doctor," Thomas said quietly. "Was a doctor. Lost my license, lost everything else. But I still know how to recognize symptoms. And this building, this whole area, it's showing symptoms of imminent structural failure." The crowd murmured. A few people laughed. The idea of the homeless man claiming to be a doctor seemed absurd to them. But Principal Anderson didn't laugh. She studied Thomas's face, and Thomas saw something he hadn't seen from anyone in months. She was actually considering what he'd said. "What kind of doctor?" she asked. "Internal medicine. But I have training in anatomy, physiology, diagnostic analysis." Pattern recognition is pattern recognition, whether you're looking at symptoms in a patient or symptoms in. He gestured at the building. That's when it happened. A tremor, not subtle this time, but strong enough that everyone felt it. Car alarms went off. Windows rattled. A few people stumbled. The crowd went silent. Thomas looked at Principal Anderson with desperate eyes. "Please." Anderson stared at the school building, then at Thomas, then at the concerned faces of the parents around her. "Mrs. Patterson," she called to her assistant. "Initiate the fire drill protocol. Everyone out of the building. Now." Thank God. Thank God she was listening. But as kids began streaming out of Washington Elementary in orderly lines, just like they'd practiced dozens of times, Thomas knew they weren't moving fast enough. Because the rumbling wasn't stopping. It was getting stronger. Thomas pulled out his notebook and looked at his calculations one more time. According to his projections, they had maybe 30 minutes before the main event. 30 minutes to get 340 children and dozens of adults far enough away from ground zero. A new fissure appeared in the parking lot, zigzagging between 2 school buses. Some of the parents screamed. And that's when Thomas Mitchell, homeless, disgraced, dismissed by everyone, stepped up to do what he'd trained his entire adult life to do. Save lives. "Listen to me," he shouted over the growing noise. "Everyone needs to move away from the building. At least 2 blocks. The collapse zone is going to be much larger than just the school." "How do you know?" someone called out. Thomas didn't have time to explain underground cavern systems and geological pressure distribution. So he told them the only thing that mattered. "Because I've been watching. And I've been right about everything else so far." Principal Anderson made the call that saved hundreds of lives. Everyone listened to him. "Move the children to Riverside Park. Teachers, take attendance there. Parents, help us get everyone to safety." And for the first time in 8 months, the people of Millbrook looked at Thomas Mitchell not as a failure or a threat, but as someone who might actually know what he was talking about. 2:47 p.m., Friday afternoon. Riverside Park had become an impromptu refugee camp. 340 children sat on blankets and playground equipment, teachers taking attendance, parents making frantic phone calls, everyone casting nervous glances back toward the school building that stood ominously quiet in the distance. Principal Anderson was coordinating with the fire department, who had finally arrived on scene. Officer Reynolds was directing traffic, keeping curious onlookers away from the potential danger zone. And Thomas Mitchell? Thomas was doing what he'd always done, watching, calculating, preparing for what he knew was coming. "The evacuation zone isn't big enough," he said, approaching Principal Anderson. She turned to him, and Thomas saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen from anyone in months: respect. She was listening to him now. Really listening. "How big?" she asked. Thomas consulted his notebook. Based on the tremor patterns and what I believe is the size of the underground cavern system, we need everyone at least 4 blocks away. Maybe 5. Fire Chief Martinez overheard and walked over. His earlier dismissiveness was gone, replaced by professional concern. That would include half the residential district. I know. You're talking about evacuating nearly 2,000 people based on. Martinez hesitated. Based on 3 weeks of careful observation and 20 years of diagnostic experience, Thomas said firmly. Martinez studied Thomas's weathered face. What did you say your background was? I didn't. But since it matters now. I'm Dr. Thomas Mitchell. Lost my license 3 years ago, but I didn't lose my ability to recognize patterns and predict outcomes. The fire chief's radio crackled to life. Chief, we're getting reports of new cracks appearing on Elm Street. Some residents are reporting tremors inside their homes. Thomas and Martinez locked eyes. 4 blocks, Martinez said into his radio. Initiate evacuation protocol for a 4-block radius around Washington Elementary. This is not a drill. For the next 2 hours, Thomas found himself in an impossible position, directing an evacuation as an unofficial consultant while still being seen by many as the crazy homeless guy who'd somehow gotten lucky with a prediction. But he wasn't done being right. At 4:53 p.m., Mrs. Chin from the corner shop approached him with tears in her eyes. Thomas, she said quietly. She was one of the few people who'd ever bothered to learn his name. My cat, Whiskers, she's still in my apartment above the shop. I couldn't catch her before we evacuated. Thomas looked toward the danger zone. Mrs. Chen's building was right at the edge of what he estimated would be the collapse area. Technically outside the worst of it, but... She's all I have left, Mrs. Chen whispered. Thomas looked at his notebook. According to his calculations, they had maybe an hour before the main event. Maybe less. Where exactly is your apartment? 2nd floor, above the shop. Window faces the alley. Thomas nodded slowly. I'll get her. Thomas, no. It's too dangerous. But Thomas was already walking toward the danger zone, ignoring the shouts from firefighters telling him to stay back. Here's the thing about being invisible for months. You learn how to move without being noticed. Thomas slipped past the emergency cordons and made his way through empty streets that felt like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. The damage was worse than he'd expected. Cracks ran like spiderwebs across the pavement. Some were wide enough to stick your hand into. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, like the calm before a massive storm. Mrs. Chen's building looked solid enough, but Thomas could see stress fractures in the brick facade. The structure was holding, but not happily. He climbed the external fire escape to the 2nd floor, each step producing small clouds of mortar dust from the shifting building. The window was unlocked. Mrs. Chin had left it open for ventilation. Whiskers, Thomas called softly as he climbed through. A frightened meow came from under the bed. Thomas knelt down and saw 2 glowing eyes staring back at him. The cat was terrified, pressed against the wall as far from the window as possible. Hey there, girl, Thomas said gently, extending his hand. Your mom sent me to get you. Whiskers sniffed his fingers, then cautiously allowed him to stroke her head. After a moment, she let him pick her up. We need to go, Thomas whispered. This place isn't safe. That's when Thomas heard it. A sound that made his blood freeze. Deep, resonant cracking. Not from above or around him, but from below. Far below. The main event was starting. Thomas clutched Whiskers to his chest and moved toward the window as quickly as he dared. But as he reached the fire escape, he heard something that stopped him cold. A voice. Human. Crying for help. It was coming from the building next door, the old Morrison place that everyone thought was abandoned. Thomas had a choice. He could climb down, run back to safety with the cat, and live with knowing he'd done what he came to do. Or he could investigate that voice and risk everything. Someone's in there, isn't it, Whiskers? He murmured to the cat. Thomas secured Whiskers inside his jacket. She seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and stayed still, then climbed across to the Morrison building's fire escape. The voice was clearer now. An elderly man, calling weakly for help from somewhere inside. Thomas tried the window. But But the building's structural damage had warped the frame enough that he could force it open with some effort. Inside, the damage was severe. Large cracks ran floor to ceiling. Pictures had fallen from walls. In some places, Thomas could see daylight through gaps in the exterior wall. "Hello," he called out. "Where are you?" "They're down here." "The basement." "Of course." Thomas found him at the bottom of the basement stairs, Mr. Morrison, the building's elderly owner who everyone thought had moved away months ago. He was trapped under a fallen beam, conscious but clearly injured. "How long have you been down here?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside him. "Since this morning, when the shaking started. The beam fell, pinned my leg." Thomas did a quick assessment. The beam was heavy but not impossibly so. Morrison's leg was definitely broken, but he wasn't in immediate danger of bleeding out. The building, on the other hand, another major tremor shook the structure. More debris fell. A water pipe burst somewhere overhead. Thomas looked at Morrison, then at Whiskers peering out from his jacket, then at the stairs leading back to what might be safety. Time was running out. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to get you out of here. But I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you." For the next 10 minutes, Thomas Mitchell, former doctor, current nobody, performed a rescue that would have impressed professional emergency responders. Using debris as leverage, he managed to lift the beam just enough for Morrison to crawl free. Then, with Morrison leaning heavily on him and Whiskers still secured in his jacket, Thomas helped them both up the basement stairs, through the damaged building, and onto the fire escape. They were halfway down when it happened. The main collapse. It started with Washington Elementary. The entire building simply dropped. Not fell over, dropped, like someone had removed all the ground beneath it. A massive sinkhole opened up, swallowing the school in seconds. Then the collapse spread. Like dominoes falling, building after building disappeared into the growing chasm. The corner shop where Thomas had spent so many mornings. The diner where he'd been laughed at. The police station where his warnings had been dismissed. The fire escape they were on shook violently, but held. Barely. Thomas looked at Morrison, then at little Whiskers, then at the destruction spreading before them. "We need to move. Now." They made it to the ground just as the Morrison building's foundation gave way. Thomas half-carried Morrison as they ran through alleys and side streets, staying ahead of the expanding collapse zone. Behind them, the earth continued to swallow buildings, cars, everything that had once made up the heart of Millbrook. When they finally reached safety, truly reached it, far beyond even Thomas's most pessimistic projections, Morrison collapsed onto the grass of Riverside Park, breathing heavily but alive. Thomas sat beside him, opening his jacket to let Whiskers out. The cat looked around at the chaos, then calmly began grooming herself as if underground collapses were just another Tuesday. "You saved my life," Morrison whispered. Thomas looked back at the destruction. The sinkhole was massive, easily 200 feet across and still growing. If the school had been in session, if those children had still been in their classrooms, "We all saved each other," Thomas said quietly. That's when Mrs. Chin came running over, tears streaming down her face. She took Whiskers from Thomas's arms, holding her cat like the precious treasure she was. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the people of Millbrook, the same people who had crossed the street to avoid him, who had dismissed his warnings, who had treated him like he was invisible, started approaching Thomas Mitchell. Principal Anderson was first. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, and Thomas noticed she used his title. "How many people do you think, how many lives did you save today?" Thomas looked around the park. All 340 students from Washington Elementary, safe and accounted for. Dozens of families from the residential district. Emergency responders who might have been inside buildings when they collapsed. "I don't know," he said honestly, but it was everyone who mattered to listen. Fire Chief Martinez stepped forward next. "Doctor, I owe you an apology." "We all do." Then Officer Reynolds. "I should have taken you seriously from the beginning." Then Jennifer Walsh from the diner. Then Mayor Davidson himself, looking shaken and humbled. But the moment that broke Thomas's heart, in the best possible way, was when 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, her arms still in a cast from weeks ago, ran up to him. "Are you the man who saved our school?" she asked innocently. Thomas knelt down to her level. "I just tried to help, sweetheart. My mama said we should have listened to you before." Emma looked at her mother, Maria, who was standing nearby with tears in her eyes. She said sometimes the most important people don't look like we expect them to. Maria stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm so sorry. The way I treated you that day," Emma fell. "You were protecting your daughter," Thomas said gently. "That's what good mothers do." As the sun set over what remained of Millbrook, the makeshift camp in Riverside Park had transformed into something resembling a community celebration, if you could call it that, when half your town had just disappeared into the earth. But people were alive. Families were together. Children were safe. And Thomas Mitchell, for the first time in 3 years, felt like he had a purpose again. Mayor Davidson approached him as the evening grew darker. "Dr. Mitchell, I have to ask, how did you know? How did you predict something that our geological surveys completely missed?" Thomas smiled sadly. "When you lose everything, your career, your reputation, your place in society, you learn to see things differently. You notice details that busy, important people miss. You listen to sounds that others dismiss as background noise." He paused, looking at his worn notebook. "And when you've spent your whole career diagnosing problems in complex systems, well, sometimes the symptoms are the same whether you're looking at a human body or a piece of ground. The irony is," Thomas continued, "if I'd still been Dr. Mitchell, if I'd had my license, my practice, my comfortable life, I probably never would have noticed what was happening underground. I would have been too busy, too distracted, too important to spend weeks sitting quietly and just watching." Mayor Davidson nodded slowly. "What will you do now?" Thomas looked around at the people who had become his community, whether they'd wanted him or not. "I think I'll stick around," he said. "Millbrook's going to need a lot of rebuilding. And someone should probably keep an eye on the ground while you're doing it." 3 months later, Dr. Thomas Mitchell reopened his medical practice in temporary facilities set up in Millbrook's new community center. The state medical board had reviewed his case and, given the circumstances and the testimony of hundreds of people whose lives he'd saved, they reinstated his license. But that's not the real ending of this story. The real ending is this: Thomas never moved back into a fancy house. He kept living simply, kept his eyes and ears open to things others might miss. Because he'd learned something valuable during those 8 months when the world saw him as worthless. Sometimes the most important job you can have is being the person who pays attention when everyone else is too busy to notice what's right in front of them. Mrs. Chen's corner shop was rebuilt, and Thomas still stops by every morning for coffee. Emma Rodriguez's arm healed perfectly, and she always waves when she sees him walking through town. And Whiskers? Well, Whiskers still lives above the corner shop, but now she has a habit of sitting by the window every morning, watching the street as if she's learned something about the importance of keeping an eye on things too. Officer Reynolds tells people that the most important lesson he learned wasn't about seismic activity or geological surveys, it was about the danger of judging people by their appearance instead of listening to what they have to say. Principal Anderson now teaches her students about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, because you never know who might be the person who saves your life someday. And Thomas? Thomas learned that losing everything isn't always about what you've lost. Sometimes it's about what you're finally free to become. The town had laughed at the beggar, until he saved them all. 1 year later, Dr. Thomas Mitchell was reviewing patient files in his small clinic when Maria Rodriguez walked in with Emma, now 9 years old and full of energy. "Dr. Mitchell," Emma called out, running up to give him a hug. "Guess what I'm doing for my school project?" "Tell me," Thomas said, smiling at the little girl who had once been afraid of him. "I'm writing about everyday heroes. And I picked you." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Emma, there are lots of heroes you could write about. But you're the one who taught me something important," she said seriously. "My teacher said heroes in movies are fake, but real heroes are people who help others even when nobody's watching. Even when nobody says thank you." Maria placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "She's not wrong, Doctor. You helped people for months when no one appreciated it. That's real heroism. After they left, Thomas sat quietly in his clinic, thinking about Emma's words. She was right about something. He had been helping people long before anyone recognized it. But there was something else, something that had been growing in the back of his mind for months. What if there were other people out there like he had been? People with knowledge, with skills, with something valuable to offer, but no one was listening because of how they looked or where they lived. That weekend, Thomas walked through the tent city that had sprung up on the outskirts of New Haven, about 30 miles from Millbrook. The earthquake had displaced hundreds of people, and many had ended up here, in temporary shelters, forgotten by most of the world. But Thomas wasn't looking at them the way most people did. He was looking for the hidden talents, the overlooked experts, the dismissed wisdom. And he found them. There was Janet Morrison, no relation to the man he'd saved, a former civil engineer who'd lost her job during the recession and never recovered. She was living in a tent, but she'd been quietly designing better drainage systems for the camp in her notebook. There was Marcus Williams, a veteran with PTSD who'd been homeless for 2 years. People saw the trauma, the difficulty he had with crowds, but Thomas saw something else. Marcus had an incredible ability to read people, to sense when someone was in emotional distress. He'd been quietly talking suicidal people out of dark moments for months, and nobody knew. There was Elena Vasquez, a former teacher whose immigration status had cost her everything. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had been tutoring the camp children for free, but no one in authority knew she existed. Thomas had an idea. A crazy, impossible, beautiful idea. 3 months later, the Millbrook Foundation officially launched. Not a traditional charity, but something different. Something revolutionary. It was a network designed to identify and connect overlooked expertise with communities that needed help. Janet Morrison became the foundation's first official consultant, helping redesign Millbrook's infrastructure to be more resilient against future geological events. The city paid her a proper salary, and she moved into a small apartment downtown. Marcus Williams started working with the police department's crisis intervention team. His ability to connect with people in distress made him incredibly effective at de-escalating dangerous situations. Elena Vasquez became Millbrook's unofficial cultural liaison, helping newly arrived immigrant families navigate systems and access services. The mayor eventually created an official position for her. But the foundation's real breakthrough came 6 months later, when Thomas received a call that changed everything. "Dr. Mitchell? This is Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, but I heard about your work through her. I'm with the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington. We've been following your foundation model and, well, we'd like to talk." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. Sarah Chen explained that HUD had been struggling with a massive problem, thousands of people experiencing homelessness across the country, many of whom had valuable skills and knowledge that could help solve community problems. Traditional programs focused on housing first, jobs second. But what if they'd been thinking about it backwards? What if, Sarah asked, we started by recognizing what people could contribute, then built support systems around that? 1 year later, the Millbrook model had been implemented in 12 cities across the country. In Detroit, a homeless former auto engineer helped design more efficient public transportation routes. In Portland, a displaced teacher created literacy programs that improved reading scores in 3 school districts. In Phoenix, a veteran with mechanical skills started a mobile repair service that employed 15 other homeless veterans. Thomas's small clinic had become the headquarters for something much bigger, a movement that was changing how America thought about homelessness, unemployment, and human potential. But the story that really brought it home happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Thomas was having coffee at Mrs. Chen's rebuilt corner shop, their morning ritual, when a young woman approached his table hesitantly. "Excuse me, are you Dr. Thomas Mitchell?" "I am. My name is Rebecca Foster. Well, I was a biochemist. PhD from Johns Hopkins. I've been homeless for 8 months after my research funding got cut and I couldn't make rent." Thomas gestured for her to sit down. Mrs. Chen quietly brought her a cup of coffee. "I've been following your foundation's work," Rebecca continued, "and I think I might have something to contribute." She pulled out a worn notebook, not unlike the one Thomas had carried during his own time on the streets. I've been documenting water quality issues in the temporary housing areas around the state. Chemical contamination patterns that match what I used to study in my lab. I think there's a systematic problem that nobody's looking at because nobody listens to homeless people about public health. Thomas smiled, remembering another notebook, another person trying to warn people about a danger no one wanted to hear about. Rebecca, he said, I think you're going to fit in perfectly. 6 months later, Dr. Rebecca Foster's research led to the discovery of widespread contamination in temporary housing water supplies across 3 states. Her work resulted in a federal investigation, new safety protocols, and ultimately prevented a public health crisis that could have affected thousands of people. She also became the Millbrook Foundation's first director of environmental health. The foundation now operates in 47 states. It has identified and connected over 3,000 people with valuable skills to communities that need their expertise. Former homeless individuals have become city planners, crisis counselors, teachers, engineers, health inspectors, and dozens of other essential roles. But more importantly, it's changed how people think. Emma Rodriguez, now in high school, volunteers with the foundation every weekend. She says Thomas taught her the most important lesson of her life. Everyone has something valuable to offer. The trick is learning how to see it. Principal Anderson, now Superintendent Anderson, has implemented mandatory, hidden talents programs in all district schools, teaching children to look beyond appearances and assumptions. Officer Reynolds became Police Chief Reynolds, and his department's community engagement programs are models for departments nationwide. And Thomas? Thomas still lives simply. Still pays attention to details others miss. Still believes that the most important job anyone can have is noticing what everyone else overlooks. But now he's not doing it alone. Last month, Thomas received a letter from a woman in Seattle. Dr. Mitchell, my name is Patricia Wong. I'm a former software engineer who's been homeless for 6 months. I've been sleeping in library parking lots, but I've also been using their computers to develop an app that could help coordinate disaster response more efficiently. I heard about your foundation through a news story, and I was wondering, Thomas smiled as he read the letter, already reaching for his phone to call the foundation's Seattle coordinator. Because he'd learned something during his journey from respected doctor to dismissed beggar to reluctant hero. The world is full of Thomas Mitchells. People with knowledge, skills, experience, and wisdom that could solve problems and save lives, if only someone would take the time to listen. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who remembers what it felt like to be overlooked, to start seeing everyone else who's been invisible. The town had laughed at the beggar, until he saved them all. And then, he taught them how to save each other. Thanks for staying with me through this incredible journey. Hit subscribe if you want more stories that change how you see the world.